This episode of the 7th Valkyrie Podcast is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description. Hey everyone, hello. Welcome to another episode of the 7th Valkyrie Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Sharp, and today I actually want to chat a little bit about some of the impetus behind kind of why and how I'm exploring some of the conflict and struggles in the 7th Valkyrie. I just thought it was kind of fun. It's a topic that I think about a lot, and it's something that I put a lot of my own brain power into, is understanding these conflicts, creating conflict. How do you resolve it? Why do you have certain conflicts? Why do I have certain ones that I prefer? Yada, yada, yada. And I just thought it would be kind of fun to kind of break that down and give you guys a little bit of a glimpse into my thought process, because it tends to be pretty deliberate. Not always. Sometimes it's just sort of like vibing and feeling. But I don't know. This is one that I think I've kind of, a few things have started to emerge. When it comes down to it, there are basically two main types of conflict I kind of tend to focus on in the 7th Valkyrie. Personal conflict and societal conflict. Now, there's a lot of, one of my favorite things I like to do is also, I'm disagreeing with myself immediately. Sometimes I do like to throw in a third type of like man versus nature, because that's a totally different kind of vibe. And I do love to have characters sort of explore nature, but those are really more moments of awe and wonder than they are necessarily kind of the central conflicts and struggles. I guess you could say that the entirety of season 1 for Cyrus was whatever. Anyway, I didn't write a bunch about those man versus nature things. I've written about them before. Nature's kind of this whole own thing for me. But the things that kind of I think are stand to the forefront most often, and will continue to as we get through 7th Valkyrie, is personal conflict and societal conflict. And societal conflict also is kind of like political conflict, but it's more of society. I feel like societal is sort of a larger scale. And I think in the world we live in right now, those are two huge questions that are worth addressing. How are we, how do we challenge ourselves and the obstacles in our lives? And also, like, how do we kind of struggle against or struggle along with the tides of something much larger, like the currents of kind of this ever-changing world in which we live in. Makes you give in and cry. Sorry, I had to live and let, when I was writing this, I had live and let die pop in my head, and then I read it over and it popped back into my head again. I literally was like, nee, nee, nee. I unfortunately, I do actually prefer the Guns N' Roses version. I know that some people, that's sacrilege. Anyway, back to 7th Valkyrie. Now, the way that I tell stories in general is from a human perspective. Like, I'm much more at home and instinctive, kind of in my element when it comes to human stories. The kind of grounded things that people face, the emotional conflict and turmoil, the personal struggles and personal journeys people have. And that's pretty much why throughout the whole story, even though we will face a lot of natural conflicts and we will see a lot of societal conflicts, we trace the world through the events of individual characters and their perceptions and how they face things. It's through their eyes, like just kind of how we see the state of the world, our own world in our own eyes, that we get to kind of glimpse that bigger picture. And here's one thing I've written about, kind of to elaborate on that further, this idea of taking one perspective. I've talked a little bit about this and how you can kind of play around with perspective and perception. And it's true, like each of these characters that I write in this series have their own biases, for sure. They're not necessarily the most, like people call that unreliable narrator. I know that that's sort of a term that has its own area, but I really think it's just everyone has their own biases and perspectives. And we do know that, like, in the world of Edera, like, perceptions of events, like whether that's through magical senses or drugs or opinions or fear or kind of, it seems to be the sort of this much closer sort of tie between how the world actually is and how people feel it is. And that gives us room to sort of ask questions about those political conflicts and kind of leave some gray area. And that's kind of a fun way that I play with those two ideas. Another thing is that a lot of these characters have magical abilities or pull or sway that kind of gives them an outsized ability to affect the world around them. It's something that an individual might not have, like battle abilities to change the tide of a fight, and so it's kind of fun to get to dive into this. And it's an interesting way, telling political and societal stories through a personal lens. It's kind of a cheeky way that I have to blend personal struggles into a political struggle and a social struggle. Like a hero at the face of an army, or like a powerful warrior, or an unearthly force like Erytheme. It puts in one character kind of this manifestation of these societal movements, and so all of a sudden one person's journey can really represent an entire group of people or an entire community or an entire society's journey. It kind of adds a more grounded feel to these sometimes high-minded or sometimes kind of more theoretical conflicts. I'm not like a super history war buff, so I much prefer to talk about how two people face each other and let that represent something far more important than I do let's talk about tactics and strategy. It's just not as much important to me. It's like the final battle between two epic forces is way cooler when it's like two wolves fighting on a lake, surrounded by magic, than and thus the tides of politics turned, and in the next election things will run a little bit differently. Anyway, I don't know. It's just sort of, it makes it more visceral and more real, and that's kind of it's just all those things. It's like how you blend personal conflict into political conflict into kind of magical, wonderful, amazing conflict. Now, this isn't all, and none of this is really new thinking. These are just kind of ideas. Like magical realism was the idea of how you could, use magical things to represent, the magical moments of life. And I know that magical realism tends to be way more grounded than fantasy, but I do draw from a little bit of that kind of idea. And I think, my perspective is you're sort of taking that to the extreme of, we live in a world where it can seem like the average person has very little say in global events. And it can be kind of comforting to be able to approach those things through a grounded lens of being able to see them, the struggles that a society or that a massive movement or group of people might have to have, and kind of face it through the struggles of one person. Again, these are the idea of an allegory is not new. But, I think it's kind of fun to show that, in even in these very fictional conflicts that could be very black and white, I still try to leave a little bit of, uncertainty, a little bit of gray area, a little bit of nuance, because that's the way the world is right now. So, and that's kind of where the magic comes in, is to kind of sum it up, basically, everything comes back to personal conflict. Because I think that's the most grounded way that we connect to stories. And then you see these moments of people interacting with nature, or a world more powerful than them, or a society. And the idea is that the struggles that each of these characters are having are very personal and are very real, but they're also sort of a lens at a much larger thing. So. Again, I'm not the first person to ever create an allegory, but that's just kind of a little bit of my thinking behind this series, and hopefully that kind of helps provide some context as we keep rolling. So anyway, hope you enjoy listening. Still working. I'm about halfway done of edits. Sorry, I've been on vacation for the past 6 weeks on and off, so it's been hard to get kind of into a rhythm. But everything's going good. We're rocking and rolling. We're thriving and surviving, and much love to all you guys. Another little longer one today, like a little 8-minuter. Thank you for listening to this episode of the 7th Valkyrie Podcast, which is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description.